Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Talk Rights to Me. I'm your host, Mike. I am a podcast host here and overall just general supporter here at the Human Rights Research Centre. With me today is Pradanya Nagru, a research and analyst at the Human Rights Research Centre, focusing on digital rights. Today, we're talking about the role of technology in immigration operations and how its use is becoming a human rights issue itself. Now, I'd like to start by getting to know you a little bit there, Pradanya. Can you tell me a bit about yourself, what interests you in this topic, and what your background is, please?
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction, Mike. In the past, I have worked with refugees and asylum seekers, and so migration is a topic that I care deeply about. And I have also researched the intersection of technology and human rights and just how digital or physical technologies can impact the enjoyment of or violation of human rights. So I just wanted to combine both of those topics and just look at some ways technology and migration intersect.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think we're going to have a really good conversation today from the research you've kind of pulled together and a lot of what's around this. I think there's a lot of untouched areas that we can go into. When we think of refugees or migrants leaving a country because of war, persecution, or violence, we usually focus on their physical safety or finding food and shelter. But what are we missing when we only look at the physical journey?
Yes, so a lot of times, my the migrants and they have networks in their home country and they might have records of protests or dissent, and any trail of movement could put these individuals and their families back home at risk, and it could expose them to the very government they are trying to flee. So I would argue that digital safety and privacy of migrants is equally as important as their physical and psychological safety. And this is a topic that's often overlooked.
Absolutely. So, what you're saying is that a phone can essentially be a tracking device for people you're running from. But at the same time, if you don't need that technology to navigate your journey and apply for asylum, does that not create a dichotomy between the two? So you've got the need for a phone to try and flee somewhere and access technology, but you can also be tracked from it at the same time.
Yes, and this is what's typically referred to as the privacy paradox. So, under the current system, migrants must give up their privacy as a condition to receiving protection in their host country. But of course, their data, their personal identity, and their every movement or details of their life going forward can be tracked and stored in host government databases, which can expose the data to misuse and exploitation. The best way to conceptualize this is to look at the state of technology use in three phases: before a
Mhm.
migrant encounters a border agent, during a border encounter, and what happens afterwards. And I would term this process the tech enabled criminalization of movement. So, this process really begins before a person even starts their journey. Governments across the globe have bilateral data sharing mechanisms that are used to monitor people even before they arrive at the border. So, this data is often used when making asylum or detainment decisions. Several sources suggest that this foreign data sharing is not always accurate or reliable. The data collected, it can be shared between governments or third-party entities without the migrants' consent, which can also put them at risk. So, for example, um, when the Bangladeshi government saw a lot of refugees coming in from neighboring Myanmar, Bangladesh, with the help of United Nations, collected biometric data and photographs from the incoming Rohingya refugees to get them registered for government services. But then that data was shared with the Myanmar government, which is the very same government the Rohingya were trying to flee from. So this is just one example of how massive data collection, even if it's for a good purpose, can turn into a problem. So governments also use a person's digital footprint when making decisions on visa applications or citizenship, and ultimately to deport or detain people and revoke visas. Social media screening is not new. Immigration officials have always asked visa applicants to provide social media handles, but the scale has completely shifted. So, for example, at least in the US, the revocation of immigration statuses based on social media monitoring is certainly a new process that we've really only seen in the past few years.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's becoming an increasing trend in a very kind of partially strange, partially scary one, I think. When I was finishing some research for my master's, the Myanmar Bangladesh border, especially around Cox's Bazar, was one that I looked at because it's such a fascinating border, but I had no idea about the digital tracking, really. Are there any kind of mechanisms to protect people from this, the data digital tracking?
So in general, in most countries, citizens have slightly better data protections than non-citizens or migrants who are coming in, and this is especially true of countries in Europe, which have to comply with the GDPR.
Yeah.
But looking at the big picture, um, there's not there's not many data protection measures that would prevent on such massive data collection at the border or from migrants at large.
Mhm.
One mechanism that individuals themselves can use to restrict some of that social media monitoring is turning off location sharing or being more mindful of what you post on social media. So while there's not a legal mechanism in place to prevent this sort of data collection from migrants, I think there are steps that individuals themselves can take to protect themselves to a certain extent.
Yeah. And what technologies are used by nations at the borders predominantly? You've mentioned a few things there. What are the kind of major technologies that are being used?
So at the border itself, countries use technologies such as drones, autonomous surveillance towers, and other punitive measures, which are intended to decrease migration. These attempts to create physical or virtual border walls have resulted in migrants taking more remote routes. So thousands who make the journey never reach their country of destination. They're lost or they pass away due to dangerous conditions they encounter, and the chances of someone being trafficked or smuggled on these alternate routes also exponentially increases. So, for example, the International Organization for Migration has a missing migrants project, and they have recorded tens of thousands of deaths and disappearances in the central Mediterranean and on the West African Atlantic route, which runs from sub-Saharan Africa to Spain's Canary Islands. Both these routes are considered some of the deadliest migration routes globally.
Mhm.
And on these journeys, migrants have to cross the sea in inflatable boats that are unsuitable to the challenges of the journey. So, they have to travel without adequate food, water, or fuel. And not only are these remote routes harder on migrants due to the geographical challenges, such as desert crossings or strong ocean currents, but the terrain can make it harder for NGOs or search and rescue operations to find these people if they get lost, to assist them if the need arises. So really, there is a lot of technology that is used at the border for deterrence purposes, but most of the time, what it really accomplishes is driving migrants to more dangerous and remote routes instead.
Yeah. And I always remember one thing that's always stood in my mind is the, let's say, worldwide photograph of the young boy, Alan Kurdi, who was the 3-year-old boy who was found sadly passed away on a beach. And the photographer took a photograph and it went around the world. It was on a Turkish shore. It was in 2015, and he was fleeing Syria to, and his family were fleeing Syria to make it into Europe. And it's really, these are small moments in many cases that we don't that we saw this case, and it became worldwide, and everyone saw the travesty that people go through to flee from dangers, from wars, from persecution. But it's not until you see an unfortunate child who's passed away on a beach does it really hit home. But in reality, this is happening all the time to people. But unless it's photographed, we don't see it. But what strikes me more is that the dangers of these routes, and the fact that hundreds of migrants go missing and never make it to their destination, that's often overlooked in the media, is it not?
Exactly. And in in a lot of these national debates about migration, such deterrent measures are considered a first line of defense without actually considering how ineffective they are and the impact such methods have on the lives and lived experiences of migrants themselves. Going back to the specific policies of using deterrence technologies, Amnesty International calls this the externalization of borders, meaning that an immigration border, instead of just being a physical boundary that separates countries, it is sort of pushed back digitally into other countries. And I would like to remind folks here that under international law, a migrant can only apply for asylum once they physically show up at a port of entry or are present within the border of the host country where they wish to seek protection. These technological deterrence tactics attempt to disrupt that process and deny individuals the right to seek asylum.
And that's fascinating, I think, because that goes against the narrative that we're predominantly shown. I know here in the UK, it's a big conversation of landing in the first for migrants, the landing in the first available safe countries where they should be staying, or they should find the right routes to get to England or the UK or wherever. It's a huge argument in our media's narrative. However, as we've just demonstrated there, that's not really what happens, though, is it? Because they can't seek asylum unless they are physically in the country, and typically this may be a safer country than others, or they've been denied access to other countries. So it seems that although we at the first stage to try to get to the country is quite difficult, but at the second stage, they are encountering these technological problems at the borders with the agents. Is that right?
Yes, so once a migrant reaches the border and encounters an agent, we will enter the phase two. And at this stage, their devices can be searched, sometimes forcefully. So, for instance, in 2020, the UK briefly implemented a secret closed door policy of seizing phones from migrants and asylum seekers that arrived by board, and the government forced them to provide PIN numbers to unlock their personal lives for scrutiny. The method was ultimately deemed unlawful by the courts once it was brought to light in 2022. But the US Citizenship and Immigration Services has recently proposed rules that would expand the biometric data that is collected by the agency. So currently, what's collected at the border are DNA samples, fingerprints, signatures, and photographs. However, there are plans to expand this collection to palm prints, voice prints, behavioral patterns, gait patterns, and gestures, which itself is alarming. And earlier this year, the DHS announced that it plans to create biometric enabled smart glasses and also use iris scanning technology at the border. So, not only is the use of these technologies an overreach of personal data collection, but the other problem here is that technology used at the border has recently also been used within the country for policing and for curbing protests. And
Hmm.
another example is license plate scanners, which, on the outside, it seems harmless, but when that data is regularly captured and logged through automated readers and shared with out of state agencies and it becomes problematic because That data can be used to create a profile of where a person works, where they live, who they socialize with, when they attend religious or political events, and something like a license plate scanner, which it has some great uses as well, but it's just another example of how when such technologies are used at the border for a very specific purpose, it can bleed into other aspects of people's lives as well.
So essentially, these immigration enforcement technologies, which is already often unnecessarily a bit excessive, they can also become tools for surveillance, what we're saying, and kind of repression for protests and exploitations in other contexts, such as license plates scanning.
Yes, and the next stage of the process demonstrates that. So, moving into phase three, the data collected during phase one and two is used by border agents and immigration officials to make asylum decisions. The US Customs and Immigration Enforcement, for example, deploys an algorithm that's outputs what's called a hurricane score. It's supposed to be a measure of whether a migrant will try to flee an agency's control. And immigration agencies in several Western countries have gone so far as to force migrants to wear smart devices that constantly track, monitor, and report their every movement. So, in the UK, for a brief period, newly arrived asylum seekers and those who were under threat of deportation were ordered to wear GPS ankle tags, and these tags had to be worn at all times, and any malfunction or dead battery or failure to check in at scheduled times could result in immigration agents showing up at their door and harassing them. And this monitoring tactic still continues and it's used to some extent in the United States as well. I don't think listeners fully understand the physical and mental toll it takes on those who must make this a part of their daily lives for months, if not years on end. People forced to wear these tags have reported difficulty sleeping due to the constant lights and alarms that go off, the need to ensure that it's always charged, and the fear of what happens if the device fails to send a signal when they fall asleep. Depression and other mental health challenges are common because of this practice. The restricted movement and limited distance one can travel while wearing these monitors can strain social interactions. It can make it harder to find or hold down a job or have some financial support
Mm.
because, as you can imagine, there is a lot of stigma attached to seeing someone wearing an ankle monitor. And the social isolation and depression can put many migrants in a dark place, and it can force them to choose between continuing to live like this in their host country or moving back home where they could face danger to their lives or well being as well.
It is really difficult to hear that because, well, firstly, as just a human, it's an awful thing to hear. But secondly, there's elements there from the UK and what we do, which I was not fully aware of. I knew we have tricky immigration policies and tricky situations or inhabitants for migrants, but knowing that hearing that they're being tracked through technology and being put in a depressive state is awful to hear, regardless of what country it's in. But it is especially in a global north country, what we'd probably previously call a first world country, for that to happen, especially in a big powerhouse like the UK and anywhere else in Europe. It's awful to hear that migrants who are trying to seek a better life or being made depressed and having mental health challenges because of a technology that they're being monitored and tracked through. Are there cases, or have we been seeing some of this being played out on stages such as the United States?
Yes, so the United States has a similar policy under what's called the Alternate to Detention Program. So, one example is that migrants are handed a smartphone by Customs and Border Protection agents with the SmartLink app installed. Now, this app what it does is it monitors the migrants' whereabouts. It constantly tracks their location using GPS. And using this app, migrants must also snap a photo at regular intervals, which is usually weekly, and send it back to their immigration agents to check in weekly. And like the ankle monitors, migrants assigned to this smartling device can get in trouble if no data is transmitted. And such practices were previously only used in the criminal justice system for those on parole or as an alternative to jail time. But recently, immigration enforcement agencies have taken up these measures as an alternative to static detention.
So I guess the question is, what's the argument behind using these measures?
So, such technologies are usually deployed under the pretense of preventing people from escaping or avoiding immigration agents or court dates. But the reality is that we know that most migrants do want to show up at their court hearings, and increasing legal representation and providing legal resources and counseling services has shown to be more effective at having a better turnout at immigration court hearings than such degrading measures that violate privacy. And we know that things like legal representation and providing other financial and legal resources works because we have the data to prove the improved outcomes. The other thing is that in the context of immigration, detention is a civil procedure and it's not meant to be punitive, but the approach that the United States and other countries take is similar to that taken with criminal detention. Alternatives to detention is meant to provide policies or procedures that disincentivize detaining people due to their migration status. And these alternatives can under the policies that are currently implemented, these alternatives can range from no detention or release without conditions to supervised release, and it can go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is holding people long term at detention centers and using electronic tagging and tracking. So, SmartLink is often touted as an alternative to ankle monitors and physical detention, but in reality, constant electronic monitoring isn't really a true alternative, and several countries have taken the approach of expanding surveillance and restricting movement rather than providing true alternatives.
Thank you for sharing that. It's truly both fascinating and slightly horrifying that this is how people are being treated in some great countries, and frankly, all these people are doing is trying to seek a better life. But I guess I'm biased because I'm on this side of the argument of providing safe routes for immigration. But what is quite scary and worrisome, is how there, in these instances, there doesn't seem to be alternative methods. There doesn't seem to be any righteous or rightful methods where people aren't being detained, where their phones aren't being scanned, as we discussed earlier. They're legally been told to unlock their phones, and then so as much as to be monitored and tracked and having to take photos every 20 minutes to show where they are. Are there any use of immigration tech which violates any international laws, which it does sound like it could be from the outside? Are there any legal obligations, or has there been an instance where the laws stepped in to try and resolve some of these problems?
So, while there is no specific law that governs the use of technology in immigration operations, the way a lot of this technology is currently used threatens not only a migrant's right to liberty and physical integrity, but also their right to seek asylum, and as well as the right to non-refoulement and non-discrimination, as has been outlined under the UN Charter and the Refugee Convention. The use of extensive surveillance and before and after arrival restricts individuals' ability to request asylum and present their case without further subjugation. Before the CBP1 app was repurposed, booking an appointment through the app with a border agent was really the only way to seek entry at the border and make a claim for asylum. But algorithmic biases and insufficient training and testing of facial recognition technology on the CBP1 app, as well as certain language barriers, left the app unusable by certain ethnic and racial groups, and algorithmic biases make in systems that make decisions about whether or not someone should be detained or whether or not their asylum case is accepted or denied. It can lead to unfair denial of asylum and a lack of due process.
So, what problems did certain ethnicities face? Is it case by case, or did they face it as a whole due to their ethnicity?
So it's generally the latter. So a lot of the facial recognition technology used within the CBP1 app, it did not correctly identify individuals of certain races and ethnicities due to biases in training data that was used in the creation of the app and the algorithms. And another problem was that CBP1 app was really only available in English and a handful of other languages. And a lot of the translations on the app were also incorrect. And so, for people who did not speak those languages, the the app was basically unusable.
So, in a way, the law has not fully evolved to address these new technological challenges. But on the other hand, at its core, international human rights law is clear on what is and is not permissible. Is that right?
Uh, yes. So while there is some ambiguity in interpreting the law, I think we can all agree that the loss of privacy, whether it's unnecessary or necessary, and this massive data collection, certainly does pose a challenge. And, I would also like to add that the right to privacy is enshrined in international law under several agreements, such as UN Convention on Human Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and several others. But the right to privacy is not absolute, so there are some baseline standards to measure whether an attempt to interfere with an individual's right to privacy is permitted. So the actions taken to curb privacy must be legal, they must be for a specific purpose, they must be necessary to the achievement of that purpose, and they must be proportionate to the attainment of the end goal. And as previously mentioned, a lot of the technology and the tactics that are currently in use in immigration enforcement are not they're not absolutely necessary to the attainment of national defense purposes that a lot of governments cite, and neither are they proportional to the violation of migrants' privacy and human rights that ensue as a result. And so the extra vigilance and constant surveillance and monitoring really suggests systemic discrimination based on the presumption of criminality that is tied to people's migration and ethnic status. And there's massive amounts of data collection can also pose another challenge, which is function creep. And function creep is defined as the expansion of data or technologies used beyond its intended purpose, right? So what happens when massive amounts of biometric data are collected? What happens to that data? Who is it shared with? How can the tracking of migration patterns be used, especially in the age of artificial intelligence? So, as an example, there was a company called Clearview AI. They're still in existence, but they came under a lot of scrutiny because they scraped the internet for over 30 billion photos. They turned each photo into a biometric code and offered their facial recognition services to law enforcement and immigration agencies. And in 2024, the Dutch government ruled that the company's actions were illegal under European privacy laws and the GDPR, uh, because the company had no legal basis for collecting biometric data. This is not the only company to do Yes, and our current administration has proven that it's willing to share data collected by one agency with other agencies for unrelated purposes.
I think it's fascinating that we've got such an evolution of technology, and that we'd assume that with this ever expanding technology would come the ever expanding protection of our rights, the expansion of our security and safety. But it appears from the research you've laid out and the examples you've laid out that this isn't really the thing. And those who are being caught out so clearly are migrants, displaced people, and people seeking refuge, which is quite a, for one, a scary and daunting prospect that those who are in the most need are the ones that are the most vulnerable.
Yes, so what I want listeners to really take away from this episode is just, look past the simple narratives about migration or really any other issue and really consider the human impact of technology use in these contexts and be aware about how massive amounts of data collection and loss of privacy can impact people at a much deeper level. So I want to leave our listeners with one final question. What happens when people become afraid to access basic services or government programs if trying to fulfill their necessities put them at risk of surveillance or criminalization? What happens if someone's migrant identity follows them forever, not because they wanted to, but because that piece of data is out there forever and it's attached to every decision they make or every decision they're forced into?
So thank you very much, Pradanya, and I want to say thank you very much for everyone who's tuned in to another episode of Talk Rights to Me. I think we've gone through some great information, and I think we've placed a lot of this in some wonderful historical contexts, such as the borders in the US, the ever increasingly fascinating border in Bangladesh and Myanmar. Certainly, around Cox's Bazar, I find it's an incredibly intrinsically difficult place, and also in the UK, which is close to my home. And I think technology, as we've seen here from some of this wonderful research Pradanya has provided, that although technology has been used to grow our security and our safety, it's also perhaps crossed the line slightly at times, where facial recognition can bring down what may be peaceful protest or somebody's right to free speech. Is this pushing too far against data protection, or is we not really being protected? I don't know if scanning license plates at the border helps, or if scanning license plates when you're on the way to your groceries can be a hindrance. So thank you very much again, everybody, for tuning in, and thank you very much, Pradanya, for coming along.